So let's talk a little chemistry, a really chemistry review, or honestly, I should say, let's talk the chemistry that we need to know to be able to do some biology. And so over in the bottom right-hand corner there, the picture showing you the hydrogen, carbon, calcium, oxygen, phosphorus, and nitrogen. Those are the six main atoms that make up all living things, with hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen being the four most common. In fact, those four themselves make up over 90% of all of the different compounds that make up every living thing. As we talk about atoms and we talk about the structure of an atom, a handful of things to keep in mind here. So one, you're going to hear me say the term atomic nucleus quite a bit. And if you've watched any of my other videos, you've probably heard me use the term nucleus for cells quite a bit. It's really important to keep in mind, guys, these are not the same nucleus. It's just the term. We're using a term here for two very different things. So an atomic nucleus is the region in the center of an atom where you're going to find things called protons and neutrons, which we're going to talk about here in a sec. The cellular nucleus, that's that little enclosure that has all the DNA inside of it, inside of a eukaryotic organism. They are not the same thing. So let's focus right now on the atomic nucleus, and we'll talk more about cellular nuclei later. So keep in mind when we're saying atomic nucleus, we are talking about that central region of the atom. And so in that atomic nucleus, you're going to find protons and neutrons. Protons are what we call a subatomic particle with a positive charge. Neutrons are a subatomic particle with a neutral charge. There's no charge to them. They actually behave a little bit like glue that holds together those positive charges. You've probably heard before that like charges repel, so pluses don't like being next to pluses in an atomic nuclei, and so the more protons you have, the more neutrons you're going to need to glue them together. In most of our simple atoms that we're going to be using in biology, things like carbon and oxygen, if you have, let's say, 6 protons, you're probably going to have 6 neutrons holding them together. As things get bigger, though, that neutron number can get a little bit messy, and you eventually will reach a point when you get so many pluses inside of that nucleus that it doesn't really matter how much glue, how many neutrons are in there, but it'll cause some radioactivity problems. Also probably heard of electrons, which are an even tinier subatomic particle. These things have pretty much what we call a negligible mass, meaning they are so low in mass that it doesn't really affect much of the total atomic mass. But the electrons do move around it in what we oftentimes refer to as electron clouds. They really can be almost anywhere in comparison to the nucleus, but there's generally certain regions that we're more likely to find them, and that's what we refer to as the electron cloud. Also keep in mind, guys, electrons are super important when it comes to the reactivity of an atom. There's going to be a lot we talk about when we talk about potential energies of certain compounds. That has a lot to do with the actual electrons. So we talk about hydrocarbons or carbohydrates having lots of energy in them. Well, the reason why they have a lot of stored potential energy is stored energy, right? The reason why things like sugars and carbohydrates have a large amount of stored potential energy is because their electrons are bound in a way that form bonds that store a little bit of the energy. And so when those bonds break, that energy can be utilized to do something like perhaps, form ATP or form other molecules or make things move. And so electrons are crucially important, not only to how chemistry works, but also to biology. This picture right here, it says the atomic structure. It's kind of a laughable term because that is actually not what an atom actually looks like, but it gives us a functional, workable model for what is actually happening inside of the atom. And so first and foremost, you may notice, if you know any chemistry, that I've got a lot more going on inside of that nucleus than the electrons going around it. I didn't want to draw too many electrons. It would just kind of make it a little bit confusing. In a stable element that has no charge, you have 3 electrons, you're going to have 3 protons. The 3 pluses kind of cancel out the 3 minuses. And so those electrons are going to usually be equal to those protons unless the element has a charge, right? And so if we're talking about something like lithium, let's say lithium -1, that basically means it's a lithium which would normally have 3 protons and 3 electrons. However, because of -1, it has an extra electron, right? And so in that case, you'd have a lithium with 3 protons and 4 electrons. The 3 protons cancel out 3 of the negative electrons, and what you're left with is lithium -1. And so you'll see that type of thing, and we'll do some examples of that later on. But realistically, the relationship between the protons and the electrons will give you the electrical charge of the actual atom. A couple things to also keep in mind up there on the right. So the atomic number you may have heard of before, that is specific to the number of protons that are in the nucleus of the atom. And so the number of protons will also tell you what element you're working with. So if you have 1 proton, the atomic number is 1, and that's talking about hydrogen. If you add a proton on, so now you're actually talking about atomic number of 2, that is helium. And so anytime you change the number of protons, you actually are changing the element because the protons are what give the element its properties. And so if you have, let's say, an additional proton, so 3 protons, that becomes lithium, right? And so I know you don't magically add protons, but the idea being that the number of protons, the atomic number, will actually determine the element that you're working with. And every element has their own specific special atom that makes it up. Anything that has 3 protons is lithium, no matter what. That is the defining characteristic of the atomic number. You also know the mass number there, so protons plus the neutrons. Remember, neutrons don't have a charge, but they do have a mass. And so if you ever have seen the atomic mass number, which is usually written in subscript on the element, so like in the small number at the bottom down there, that is telling you the number of protons and the number of neutrons. So if you look down in the bottom right down here, where I have carbon. So top number up there is the atomic number. So carbon has an atomic number of 6, which tells me it has 6 protons. And normal, like periodic table carbon has an atomic mass of 12, which I know it has 6 protons. And so that would tell me that it also has 6 neutrons, right? So 6 plus 6 gives me my atomic mass of 12. You see that picture next to it where it shows carbon-14. That's actually a radioactive isotope of carbon. It still has 6 protons, but that won't change. The atomic number does not change. But now that that mass number is different, it tells me it has 2 additional neutrons. So 6 protons, 8 neutrons. And that is going to give me a radioactive isotope of carbon, which we're going to talk about carbon-14. It's a really cool isotope. Shows up a lot in things called carbon dating. It's actually a radioactive isotope that's inside of pretty much every living thing. Also, we're talking about electron shells. So electron shell is the area we are most likely to find an electron in comparison to that nucleus. So remember, guys, electrons are kind of tricky. They're moving really fast around the atomic nucleus. So they can really kind of be anywhere. And so when we're talking about the electron shell, we're just basically saying the most likely place where that electron can be found, right? And so those electrons, they're likely to be in these certain fixed energy levels. And if you add energy or you take energy away from an electron, you can actually move it to a different shape. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as orbits, kind of like planets around the sun. Chemistry's kind of shied away from that a little bit. It's still a really functional model to think of it moving to like a different orbit. However, it's just not super realistic when you're talking about the chaos of something as small as an electron moving as fast as they are. But if you prefer to look at it from an orbit standpoint, you can do that. In fact, you'll hear me talk a lot about the energy levels or the clouds in orbit structure, just because it makes it a little easier to understand. You'll really hear that talked about a lot when we talk about things called valence electrons. And that's really what we're talking about, the reactivity of an atom, what the electrons are trying to do. And so I like to picture it like the picture over there on the side, where the nucleus is in there in the middle, and then you've got the electrons kind of floating around it on the outside. Again, not super realistic for the actual function of the chemistry, but as far as understanding what it's doing, it works pretty well. And then also keep in mind that when we're talking about electrons and we're talking about what electrons are doing, sometimes electrons are getting actually moved between different atoms. And so when we talk about things like ionic bonding, what that is a bonding where an electron is transferred from one atom to another. And when that happens, it's going to change the charges of those atoms. And anytime an atom has a charge, we call it an ion. And so that's what we call an ionic bond. And we'll go into the details of that a little bit later. But you see at the bottom of my picture over there where it talks about likely to lose electrons or likely to gain electrons, that's what we're talking about, the idea of what's happening when those electrons get transferred, usually in the formation of an ionic bond.